Good afternoon, Lou McWhorter again. Welcome to Introduction to Security Foundations in the Cybersecurity Program. I'm the instructor and current author of the security program. We use these lectures to supplement and support the course materials, and so what I want to do is just give you an overview of what we're going to do today and next week, and for that matter, as we go on through the courseware. We held one of these video lectures each week. And of course, if people attend, then we can answer questions, etc. And then we also have a second one, and they cover basically, we split the units in half, give or take. And so this week we're going to cover the first 5 lessons in security foundations, and then next week we'll cover the remaining. And then of course we'll go on as you move on through the program. You'll move into network foundations and system admin, etc., etc. And this model continues. Generally, what we try to do with these lectures is to try to add a little bit more value to the material and maybe use some different examples that are already in the written. So if you're not getting a concept, then you maybe have a different idea of how that works. And then we try to make sure we're hitting the really important points. In later classes, we'll do some additional demos of how to set things up and work on our topographies and things like that. But this class is a beginning class, the intro class. And so what we're looking at in this class is to set the stage for the rest of the program. We want to make sure we've exposed you to a lot of key concepts and key terms and things that you're going to see again and again and again throughout the course and actually throughout your career in cybersecurity. And so that's what lesson 1 starts with, is an introduction to information security. Then we talk about how security comes from the Latin and things like that. I'll leave you to read that from the material. But the idea is that with cybersecurity, what we're attempting to do is to protect the informational assets, the digital assets, the information, the technology, the servers, the devices, the firewalls, the routers, everything you can imagine, the whole enchilada, so to speak, of the IT infrastructure. And we're doing that not just in a vacuum of we do security for security, but we do it in the context of we're trying to enable whatever organization we work for to conduct its mission. IT in principle and security in particular are not done, like I said, in a vacuum. They are done to accomplish certain goals. And so, IT folks and security folks sometimes get caught up in all the zeros and ones and bells and whistles of what they do. And they sometimes forget that what we're trying to do is enable the organization. We're going to see this next week as we start to bring all this together into a concept called organizational security. But information security in the broadest sense is to protect the digital assets, the information assets, and so this can include everything from like customer list to, if you're a software company, or your proprietary source code, digital marketing materials, proprietary information, confidential documents, etc. And you want to be able to protect all that information. And you have to, as a matter of fact, one of the big things, and it's a key concept, like I said, you're going to see a bunch of these again and again, but we have a very key concept in security called the CIA triad. And we're not talking about the Central Intelligence Agency. We're talking about 3 critical securities. In a sense, you could say it's what we in security promise to do, or what we strive to do when it comes to information security. We want to protect the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of all of that information. And if we can accomplish that, then obviously we've gone a long way toward accomplishing our overall goals, at least conceptually. And so what do those mean? Well, confidentiality, obviously information is, at different levels. Some information is totally public. You put it up on your website, it's disclosed. Nobody has any problems with. And on the other hand, then there's obviously information that only salespeople need to see, only accounting people need to see, only senior management needs to see, only the developers need to see the inner workings, per se, of the software or the game, the program you're writing. And so we have different levels. And so as part of security in IT, we have to protect that confidentiality. We want to make sure that data is only available to the people who have the appropriate access rights and authority to access that data. We want to make sure that those that do need it can get it, of course, and that builds into one of the others in a second. But confidentiality is making sure that only the people who are authorized to access data can access data. The integrity piece of the equation is that we want to make sure that the data stays protected and undisturbed, unchanged. We want to protect its integrity. If you think about one of the things that theoretically could be done and has been done a lot in the public media's point of view of hackers, but hackers try to get in and change things in a database. They want to change, whether they're a young kid, they want to change their grade, they want to change their outstanding balance, they want to change something so that they can cause a problem, whatever. And so that is what integrity is about, is to prevent unauthorized changes to the data. We want to maintain that the data, or make sure that our data is maintained in a safe and secure way. And so just like that, it's maintained confidential to only people who have access. And then also it needs to be maintained as secure and safe and unmutable. We don't want it to change without there being a digital trail, a paper log, if you will. Obviously, data in organizations changes all the time. You change the balance as you bill your customers and they pay you, and you add new documents to your document stores, you create new marketing plans, etc. So data is changing all the time, but we want to allow that in principle where it needs to be changed, but we want to make sure we know sort of who did it. If somebody changes the data, then we need to know that it's only certain people who had rights, and we can look in our system and we can do an audit and we can see, oh, Susan was logged in and that change was made, and we can find out whether it was an accident or if it was on purpose or what the deal was, and so we want to maintain the integrity of our data. And then availability is the concept that really helps. I mean, if those are about protecting the data, we also have to maintain the availability of our data. And that means that all of those people who do have the rights to see certain data or do have the rights to access and potentially modified data have to have it available to them, or that's pointless. Even if they have all the great rights, but your network is down or a hacker has taken down your system and taken down your data center, then obviously we're not providing that availability, because once again, we're not doing this in a vacuum. We're doing this to enable the organization. And so if your salespeople can't, if you've got a group of people who are calling on salespeople, so calling on prospects, if they can't get to that list and they can't pull up that list of potential leads to call, then your outbound sales force is dead in the water. If your accounting people can't get to the accounting data, they can't process payments, they can't send out any bills to get any more payments, et cetera, et cetera. So that CIA triad, should say, it is a triangle, but nonetheless, the CIA triad is the sort of the chief commitments that we're trying to make, the promises, the goals of protecting those three promises, those securities. There's a lot of other key terms. There's a whole page of them in there. I'll let you guys read those if you have any questions, of course. But one of the other things I wanted to really talk about, because it kind of sets the stage, and it's just like every time I do one of these lectures now over weeks and multiple sections now, I think we're up to the 7th of this course, so welcome. But it seems like there's always something new. And so, why is security so hot right now? And it really is. And it really doesn't take much further than to look at the news to see why. It seems like it seems almost rare that I don't go to one of the major news sites and find some new story of some new hack or some new breach, or an expounding upon that story. Today in the news, last few days, we've had the story of the Cambridge Analytics potentially accessing inappropriately, potentially building psychological profiles on 50 million plus Facebook users as part of their work to help various campaigns and to do what they do. We know that there's a lot of organizations that are trying to track everything we do out there on the net, to track and better serve us ads. And so there's always these breaches. We had the Equifax breach be reported to be larger. The Yahoo breaches reported to be larger. There are literally just hundreds and hundreds of millions of compromised accounts available out on the internet, on the dark web. As a matter of fact, in a later class, at least to get an idea of the sheer scope, and we use a subset of some of the data from this, but there's a couple places out there on the net where a lot of these breaches you may have heard about, you can literally go and download all that information. Now, it's usually been anonymized a little bit. One of the things that they're trying to do is, basically, let researchers be able to analyze. You see those articles every so often. What are the 10 worst passwords ever? And obviously you never want to use one of those or anything even remotely on there. So these lists are used, and researchers do analysis. We actually even use them sometimes in authentication systems. And you try to log in and try to create a new account on some place, and they will say you can't use that password. We've seen something like it. Well, that may be because they're using some of these databases basically of all this breach data to go, well, if these are out there and they're known and they've been cracked, we don't want to let new members use those same usernames and passwords again. And so it is just amazing the amount of information. And of course, as security professionals and researchers, we can use that data to run tests. We use a subset later to do a brute force test, and as part of the network defense class, learning a little bit about vulnerability and penetration testing. We use a subset of sort of the worst username and passwords when we run some brute force attacks. But of course, researchers can use these, businesses can use them. We do a lot of analysis of them, try to figure out, how to put those lists together and thus keep people. But where I'm getting at is just the growing challenges that we face is just, it's immense in this field. Everybody, and I mean everybody, if you have a publicly facing server on the internet in any way, shape, or form, whether that's in their office, that's in a data center that they're hosting somewhere, or up in the cloud these days where everything's virtual, up on Amazon Web Services, Google Cloud, et cetera, and you'll learn a lot more about that going forward. But regardless of where that infrastructure is, whether it's a physical box or a virtual box, I can assure you that it is under attack. It is under attack in real time right now. I'm sitting not too far from some of my servers that are on the internet, and I can guarantee you they're under attack right now. You have to be able to defend them. And so as part of this process, we're going to learn all about best practices and all kinds of things that can help defend our networks and defend our systems. But the challenges just continue to grow. We have more and more breaches. And so there are more and more, information out there about usernames and passwords that can be used. And many times nefarious people will take those breach lists and then go and attack other sites. Because as we know, many people are not very good about using multiple passwords, using a password manager, whatever the case is. There's also just the sheer growth. I mean, 20 years ago, there were only a handful of people on the internet. Most people didn't know what the internet was. Maybe they had seen a web browser or had used something like an older dial-up service like CompuServe or AOL, but it was a much smaller world. And now, of course, the vast majority of people on the planet are actually getting wired up, even in the developing world, as they jump and leapfrog PC infrastructure and go straight into smartphones and devices like that, where they're able to get on the net. And so we just have this growing and huge number of devices, and that's even being magnified by two concepts we'll definitely talk more about throughout the whole program: embedded systems and the Internet of Things. And really, embedded systems are just embedding computing devices into things. The phrase embedded system usually refers more to driving equipment, like sensors and regulators and pieces of equipment on, let's say, a factory floor or in a plant or something. But we're seeing that when we talk about the Internet of Things, that's really just taking embedded systems and putting them into stuff and now putting them out into the consumer market instead of into the sort of manufacturing or business world. And it's really the same thing. Those devices, whether that's the Nest thermostat, your new baby monitor, whatever the case is, all of these devices are more and more getting wired up. We have refrigerators, coffee machines. I have literally seen, it was surprised me, but there is a water faucet that can actually be connected to the network. And it's meant, like so many of these devices, to be able to share the data on your water usage and things like that. But of course, now you've got a water faucet in your house and the person who showed it was in a class I took actually on security. They showed it as an example of something that surprised them. They were watching the person install this faucet. It hadn't been discussed that this was a functionality. This is just the faucet they sold that was like the one they had, a big old loop or whatever. They said they wanted a replacement for that, so they brought him out one. And the guy was watching the installer, and he's like, "What is that?" And he looked at the piece, and there was a jack. And so it is amazing, the things that are going on. We're having a huge growth of things, which means we have more and more devices. As a matter of fact, devices you may not have even thought about. What if somebody at the organization you work for goes out and replaces the office microwaves kind of the same way? They're not thinking of anything smart. They're not trying. They're just getting a microwave for the break room. But that microwave is a smart microwave now. And, somebody, whether they do it or just somebody else comes in and says, "Oh, that's the same one I have at home, and I have an app that can tell me when it's done, so I'm going to plug it in." And now you've got a device on your network that you didn't even know about potentially. So these are things that are making the challenges of cybersecurity. Plus, then all these devices, many of which on this Internet of Things, are not very well protected. And so we saw not too long ago, talking about headlines again, just recently the largest, now it's the second, to be honest, second largest denial of service attack was actually carried out by just millions, thousands, whatever the number, I don't know, but a huge botnet of all cameras and monitors and routers and things like that have been taken over by these nefarious actors, and then they use them to send all their concentrated traffic at whatever the target was for the denial of service. So we have to be aware of these continually evolving challenges, and we're just facing these challenges. And it's one of the reasons it's making this market so hot. And it's one of the reasons there's so many open field positions in the field. And that actually leads into the next thing we talk about. We talk about in lesson 2 about security roles. Now we do this for 2 reasons. We initially talk about what we call some conceptual roles. And the reason we point those out is because as we get later, and even in the next few weeks, next week we'll talk about something called security frameworks. And these are these collections of documents and guidelines and all that. We'll get to that. But they help an organization develop their own security plan. They provide best practices, templates, and various things like that. And when you read those, they may use some of these conceptual terms, things like CIA or like some of these roles, because we talk about generally kind of conceptually if you think about an organization, then that we usually in security break up security roles into these conceptual roles of either that somebody is an owner of data. Now that means that they don't physically own it, take it home in a big company, but they own the process, own it. They're the one responsible. They're the VP of sales. So by definition, they own the sales database, the sales leads and things like that. And so what is that owner? That owner has certain responsibility. They're going to tell you how important it is. They're going to tell you, what's critical about it, what impact it would be if it's down and gone, things like that. And that's going to feed into, your security planning and prioritization. You also have people who are kind of the custodians of data. And then you have people that are the security officers that are supposed to help monitor and maintain the policies and procedures in place to protect that data. And then, of course, the vast majority of people in an organization are just users of data. And this can be senior people. It doesn't matter. So if you're not an owner or a custodian or a security officer, those are conceptual roles. Which we talk about in the lesson, and are pretty narrow to senior management or key senior IT and security people who usually have those roles. Like the person who manages the email server is kind of the custodian of the email data. They may not be the owner. Maybe that's the head of IT, or maybe that's HR. I don't. The owner can be defined. Those are conceptual roles. But you'll see in the frameworks they'll talk about, well, the owner will be responsible for this, and the IT, etc. So we want you to understand those conceptual roles, because you will, see them again in some of these frameworks. But then the rest of that lesson is really about, and I won't spend a lot of time on it because it's easy enough for you to get through. It talks about different types of roles: intermediate, intro, intermediate, advanced. This program is meant to give you a foothold and an entry into the cybersecurity field. As you know, when you join this program, it has a little bit of prerequisites, so it's not a just beginning level right out of, okay, I don't know how to turn on a computer. You're supposed to know some basics and have a little networking, etc. And as part of this, you're getting geared toward that entry level position and being able to take Security Plus as a certification program. So, but right here at the beginning, after talking about those conceptual roles, we wanted to kind of give you an idea, and matter of fact, it's even one of your exercises, of what's ahead for you potentially. And there's different ways to go in this field. You might start out as just a general analyst, working in a job, starting out as a security analyst. And then you have multiple ways to go. You might ultimately be the chief information or chief security officer for an organization. If you want to go those ways, you're going to broaden your skill sets, probably add some management training, whether that's on the job, one of those seminars, or an MBA if you go really far with a big organization, but you got time. This is the beginning. If you're going to go, somebody said, I think it's maybe, I can't remember exactly where I heard this, but if you would like to, wreak havoc, then maybe being a pen tester is the way to go. And you can either be a penetration tester for a larger organization, or you can be an independent or work for the smaller service firms. There's a lot of firms that's exactly what they do, is they provide that service. And it's a very common service that even in large organizations that have their own staff and maybe do their own internal vulnerability and penetration would still source that out maybe once a year, once a quarter, or whatever, to get an outside assessment. And so there's roles there. And then of course there's roles all in between, from sort of those. You can be an auditor, you can be a security system administrator, somebody who's running a security team, an incident response team manager, all kinds of different roles. So we wanted to kind of give you an idea of where you can go after this. And this course in some ways should help you analyze sort of what your interests are. If you see yourself really getting happy with the hands-ons in some of the other classes and hacking away on an exploitable server and going further than even the exercises take you, then that may be your interest. And so maybe down the line, you'll want to continue down that road, get the certified ethical hacker or pen testing certification. There's one of those from CompTIA that goes on further than Security Plus, etc. On the other hand, you might want to go different routes. So we wanted to present that to you. And we talk a little bit about employments and stats, but I won't get into that. Then lesson 3 gets into attacks and attack vectors, a little bit of attack threats, what we call threat actors, the individuals or groups that can actually carry out these attacks on us. And so we have usually broken up in this lesson, we've broken up things into kind of what we call standard attacks. Like I said, things are so rapidly evolving, we may get before the year's over and have to make 3 categories out of this or change things. But in the biggest sense, I think they'll fit for a while. We have standard attacks. These are attacks that have been around for a while. I've been doing this for a long time. And so, people have been attempting to brute force attack and pass in a lot of passwords for as long as there's been authentication. And there's been, people did that on dial-up bulletin board systems before, people were really commonly on the internet. It definitely happened in the earliest days of the internet. And it happens today, all day, every day, that there's somebody out there trying those type of basic attacks, trying to log into a machine, trying those 10 worst passwords or 100 worst passwords against common accounts, hoping they can get in. It's one of the reasons that if you do the basics of security and follow sort of the basic, you can eliminate a lot of these kind of standard, kind of attacks, because we know about them. They've been going on for a long time, but they're still going, and they can be modified, etc. But any of these type of standard, escalation attacks, trying to break in, they've been around for a while. We kind of know what to do, and we fairly well handled those. But the problem is there are all kinds of newer attacks that are coming on board, and we're seeing more and more of. And so you have the situation where, like I mentioned, is the microwave now in your break room now an attack vector? Could somebody get in somehow to that device, and then now that they're in it, be able to use that to, yes, theoretically, that's a possibility. And we're beginning to see things like this. What about these home devices? Like I said, until just recently, now what is the most second largest denial of service attack ever was used by somebody taking over a whole bunch of Internet of Things type of devices and then basically using them to send, just gazillions of requests at the target and thus overwhelm them, is what a denial of service attack does. And so while denial of service attacks are standard attacks, they've been around for a while, they're also in a way new attacks because they're being done in new ways. They're being done where we magnify, we use multiple and larger numbers of devices. It wasn't even possible. I mean, there are more devices that have just come on in the last couple of years than there were in the first 20 years of the internet period. So you can imagine, as we bring more and more devices on and people are able to use them, they can use them for all kinds of nefarious means. There are all kinds of different attacks. There's a couple that I like to give some different examples. As I said, one of my favorite combines another thing we talk about in there, and we'll talk about it a lot more. You'll actually get to, in some ways, kind of learn more about it and even see how it kind of works. But that's social engineering. Social engineering has been around in forever, but we also, and so people have been faking their way into systems or faking their way, manipulating people to get what they want in the system, access to a computer, access to a server, access to a data room, data center, whatever, for years. But they've also now evolved too. You are getting these emails, and I say you because you are, everybody who's watching this video now or future classes, I can guarantee we've all gotten them. They look like they come from your bank. They look like they come from something legitimate, your mortgage company, whatever. Netflix is one that I got recently personally. And they look so real until you start really, looking at the email and hold it, that's not the right return address. They're not using Netflix.com. They're not using Bank of America. They're using some other site. And if they're really bad, maybe you can tell that the link's going to take you to .ru, Russia, or someplace else. But sometimes they even register domains that look kind of like it. So it's, they try to make it look like it. And hopefully you won't pay attention and you'll click that reply, you'll open that attachment, you'll go to that link. And of course, that's what we call phishing. And in the broadest sense, if somebody sends out, 100 million emails, or, as spam, pretending to be Netflix, they know that about a third of the country uses Netflix. So about a third of the people will at least look at that and go, maybe that's me. And maybe they'll click on it. And some percentage, of course, will. And sucker born every day, as they say. And so anyway, they know that's one of the reasons that we probably will never see the end of spam unless we drastically change the underlying net infrastructure, because there's no cost to spammers. It doesn't cost them. They're using other people's systems. They've taken over your machine and sending that virus out the back, sending that email out. I've taken over people's websites to host those malware. So it's not costing them anything. And so the marginal cost for them is nothing. And if they get 1 in a million, that's profit. And so that's why this keeps continuing. But a newer form we call spear phishing is where now somebody has analyzed you, not just, okay, I'm going to try to sucker a bunch of Netflix users or Bank of America users, but you. I am after you, and I'm going to do my research. I may break into another place. I may do whatever. I literally had this happen to a client or they became a client when it happened to them. They had a very targeted spear phishing campaign, as an example. A couple of the senior people were targeted. One of the senior people was involved with a nonprofit. The hackers attacked that nonprofit, broke in to that nonprofit, a much weaker defended. They weren't able to directly break into the company they were targeting. So instead, they found out about them sort of on social media. Oh, well, the guy who runs this place is on this profit, so we're going to go break into that. They were able to do so. And then what they did was, using that email account from the nonprofit, they sent an email to an employee within the firm saying, hey, take a look at this. That person knew, of course, that person. As a matter of fact, the hackers knew too. That person kind of, with whatever email address they were on, they would do their work. They would use that nonprofit to send an email to one of their work people. That just happened to be what they did. So it wasn't uncommon for this person to use that account to communicate into the office. And so the accountant gets this email, opens the email, opens the attachment. It's supposed to be something to look at, but it doesn't open any kind of viewer. They think, oh, I'll ask him when he gets back in the office later. Don't think much about it. Go on about their business. But that was actually a Trojan that they had just run. And these hackers were able to then get in the next days, and over the next couple nights, they were transferring $5,000 in a pop out of their account to prepaid credit cards. And ultimately, they had done that for a number of days until they tried to get greedy and get 20,000, because the first two had gone through. So they went out more and they went for 20. And that set off alarms at the bank and at the company. And I was brought in. We had to clean all that up, and they were able to get some of the money back and stop that last big transaction. But some of the money was gone. And so this is what I'm talking about when I say challenges and new things. This is just a mid-sized company anywhere. America happens to be here in Texas, but the point is, this is happening all the time now, and then they're getting much smarter. And so that's a form of social engineering. They social engineered that person, but they made it so believable because it literally came from the account that this person used over at that nonprofit. So this is sneaky stuff, and we have to be aware. And these require us to be even more knowledgeable and to take further steps to defend. So who are some of these people doing this stuff? Well, we divide threat actors into a number of different classifications. At the lowest end, we generally gather up a lot of folks that are usually a little more inexperienced, new to the game, if you will. We call them script kiddies. And the reason that is because, and I always joke that we get a new crop of them every year. And matter of fact, it's only been a few months since the new crop was born. It's usually around Christmas time. And some kid gets their new computer. And, most kids start talking to their friends and going to play Minecraft or whatever game they like online when they get their new computer. But there's a percent every year. I see it in my logs. I can see it. I can guarantee it. They immediately get their computer and they hug their mom and dad and whoever gave it to them, grandma, and they head up to their room and they set it all up and they go to a hacking site. and they download some malware and they download some tools, and all this stuff is off the shelf. Half the tools are the same tools as you're going to find out we use in security. We use the same tools. We're trying to use a tool to scan our network to make sure all the machines on it are ours and we're controlling it. They're trying to use the same tools to scan our network to find out who to attack. And so of course there are off the shelf attack tools too. And so these young kids, many times, that's the script kiddie name, will go download some scripts and they'll start running. Now, they are doing, in many cases, even though that is changing, we're seeing things get more sophisticated that even the amateurs can use, newer attacks, but that's still rare. But the old school just brute force attacks, trying common, break into a WordPress site, break into an authentication on a web, break into a SSH server, break into an FTP server, whatever. They can download scripts and just fire them off and pick a random IP address or pick their friend's Minecraft server, as the case may be, that they might be their initial hack target. But of course, some percentage of these are born every year, and then some percentage migrate up the chain. At some point, they will face a choice, one way or the other. And they will either join a program like ours or go to school at someplace else, or learn on their own, take some certifications and become a professional. There's all kinds of ways to get into this field, especially in this day and age still. And these programs definitely help, and there's lots of them like ours. We think we have one of the best, but nonetheless, there's all these different certification programs you can take, and so you basically have a choice. Are you going to end up becoming a white hat hacker, or are you going to be becoming a black hat hacker? And so, of course, that's the next category, is the criminal. It used to be that people who went beyond just being an amateur script kiddie playing around in the innocent wild west of the internet, things I did when I was a kid that would get attention today didn't back then. Probing around on networks to see what was going on, that you can't really do that stuff anymore. Even it's for fun, just to learn. So you have to. You're already breaking the rules if you're not doing like we do in this class. We're going to teach you how to do it all in simulations and things. That way you can learn safely, test all this stuff out, and then be able to take that knowledge and to defend real networks. And then you'll get to work for real there. But we can learn all of our skills. And of course, the hackers can do the same thing. They can play against simulators and emulators and learn. But they'll, of course, especially either because they're innocent script kiddies who don't know any better and they get away with it, or of course over time, then some become black hat hackers. It used to be a lot of stuff was done for fame and kind of notoriety. Today, the biggest motivating factor is sheer money. All that spam, all that junk, all these hacks, all these breaches, it's really about money. You can sell those lists on the internet, the dark web part of the internet at least. You can use them for identity theft, all kinds of things. And of course, it just goes on and on. There's all kinds of direct types of things that you can do. We've seen people writing malware that infects people's computers so it can mine bitcoins for them. This is the world we live in today, and we have to be aware of all these. So criminal actors are huge. The group that attacked that client of mine, that was a criminal gang out of Eastern Europe. That's about as far as we could trace it, and they are very good at what they do. Actually, even their malware goes away itself after less than a day. That seems wild. Why would they do that? Well, because like you might have gotten that malware, even if maybe they targeted you, maybe you or somebody in your organization, and they clicked on that link and it installed. It sits back there quietly for about a day, and it watches in case somebody goes to the bank and they log in and capture that material. But if it doesn't find that, so it gets on an HR person's computer, gets on a salesperson's computer, and they never log into a bank, and they don't care about personal. Like, I'm gonna be honest with you, that could have been on your machine. You could have logged into your bank. If it wasn't, one of the bigger banks, and it wasn't like a corporate type of thing, they won't even capture it. They're really slick. And then if it doesn't find what it wants, it removes itself cleanly because it doesn't want to be found and get in the database of a known thing. And they update their little targeted Trojan every so often. And so they're a known group that we did find some information through Norton and some of the other big they've seen signatures from these folks, but they don't know exactly who they are. And they're constantly changing. And so, like I said, criminal hackers are huge. Another big group that we're seeing a lot more of, and it's becoming more in the news as well, is the nation state players. We have seen this more and more. We're seeing attacks from, if it's not a direct nation state player, there's at least an argument that some of the groups are sort of nations sponsored, even if they're a degree of cutout to say, oh, well, no, they're just patriotic XYZ, whether that's, and there's been a number of things. So we've had hacks in South Korea that some people blame against North Korea. The Sony hack after that movie came out, most people in the field think that was North Korea or North Korea inspired hackers. We think there are a lot of people in the industry that feel that some of the things that have targeted Ukraine, given all the war, have been once again Russian inspired against them. There's an argument, though never claimed, that either America and or Israel were responsible for attacks against the centrifuges with the Stuxnet virus. We talk a little bit about that at one point in the course program. And just the other day, I read about what may be the scariest new version of that as far as, though no one's claimed it and no one's officially said it, but there's a high degree that they may have learned from that, and now they're coming back. Because apparently late last summer, there was an attack on a Saudi Arabian refinery that experts are now saying came very close to blowing up the facility, to causing physical damage and causing an explosion. And as they took the same kind of playbook of, well, we're going to mess with these control equipment and thus, let's stop this valve from putting cooling water into that reactor or whatever, even though we're going to report to the control room, everything's fine. And then, of course, if you can build up those pressures in a refinery or a reaction chamber in a nuclear plant, for God's sakes, whatever. So once again, these challenges we face, so nation state actors in one form or another, whether directly, we obviously have people that work for our government, NSA, CIA, FBI, government, and then the DoD, that are cyber warriors that are meant to protect and potentially take action if we need to. And then we obviously have individual groups. And that's another big thing, is that where do these fall? Is the sort of terrorist, activist, and I'm not trying to jump everybody in a category and say they're all the same, but all different kinds of groups that have spun up to fight for a particular cause and hack for a particular cause. And you'll find groups on each side, and they may not be nation state players, but they're kind of national inspired. Or you could take a group like Anonymous that has sort of fallen a little off the radar, at least from what I see lately, but was very big a few years ago with attacks of all kinds of anything that any member of Anonymous, it seemed, decided was something worthy of attacking, whether that was cops that were taking the protesters off of the, say Times Square or whatever. So they attacked a lot of police departments back in the day. They've attacked other individuals and organizations that they feel have taken a side on something they disagree with. So we have activists and hacktivists, as they're called. So we have all these different players. And it's important to know, and we'll talk more about them in a little more detail later in the other courses, because it's important to understand, if you understand them, their motivations to a degree, their resourcing to a degree, then you can kind of get an idea of what you may be up against. The script kiddies, like I said, the vast majority of the stuff that people just download something and start running some attack, whether it's targeted at you or just targeted at a random IP range on the internet, which is surprisingly uncommon. Surprisingly common. It's a lot of the times these bots and these networks just attack, and they randomly generate another number and they go attack, and they take over one, and then it starts attacking, and they spread the botnet, or find the weakness again and again. But if you can learn from our program and do these very basic things like never use default passwords, stay patched up, all the stuff you're going to learn, then a lot of that, if not almost all of that, just goes away. You're not using bad passwords, you've disabled certain accounts, you've hardened your systems, you've done all these basic things we're going to teach you. And in the process, you can make most of the script kiddie stuff go away. That doesn't mean a slightly more advanced script kiddie that's gotten beyond just the basic scripts and is starting to learn to manually do things might be able to manipulate, but at least you would know that you would start to ideally, hopefully, see signs of that with your layered defenses, as we're going to talk about, even if they got through one layer. But of course, if you have ultimately are being targeted because you're in the right industry, the right space, the wrong place, if it's an activist that's just decided your sector's bad or whatever, then all of a sudden you've got a slightly too much higher level of sophistication, resourcing, and this has even led to something we now refer to as an advanced persistent threat. Script kiddies run a script that tries to pound on your mail server and figure out if you can get in, or find out your usernames, or try to log into your web server or whatever, and they run their course. They try their 1,000 or 10,000 or 1,000,000 passwords if they can get away. Your systems hopefully will block some of this if you see the patterns. But that's even its own degree of a challenge. That it used to be, it was really easy if somebody, especially the script kiddie, all of a sudden you would see from California, Chicago, wherever in the world, here's an IP and it's just pounding away, logging in again and again, or attempting to. And then, you could set up, it's pretty common, most systems now after so many attempts will just lock you out. And that's why, because of these brute force attacks. But one of the things that they've gotten better at over the last number of years, even script kiddies to a degree, because there's a way, they can build their own botnet pretty easy. If you run the things and you end up finding 1,000 or 10,000 whatever type of device, home routers, cameras, servers on the net that were default passworded, whatever, and you run and you take them over and get control of them, then you can have them start doing other things for you, whether that's sending spam or attempting to log in. And so one of the things I've seen over the last number of years really grow is that instead of just seeing IP 1.1.1.1 just pound away 1,000 times trying to all those passwords, you'll see IP 1.1.1.1 hit once. And then IP 224.75.35, whatever, will hit again. And then another IP will hit, and another IP will hit. And the reality is, especially if they're doing one of the alphabet type of attacks, where they're literally starting, with Abel and Abe and going down through Amy and Bill and Sue and all the way through the alphabet, you can see that if you look in the logs over time, oh my God, that's someone is trying to do all of this sort of worst password, worst usernames, but every single request is a separate IP. So how do you block that? And even if you go and block retroactively all those IPs you see for future, they've already done their one. Well, of course, I actually think there's still some value in blocking them. That's a compromised system that's already tried once to attack your system. And so it's why not block it? It's going to probably come back and do it again. But we'll look at more of that in other classes, and you have to make your own decisions. And of course, a lot of the stuff you can wipe out, with things we're going to learn about how to set up firewalls and intrusion detection and other type of stuff. But, just keeping it simple at this point. You've got a machine on the net and it's being hit. These are what you're going to see. And so we have a lot of different, new variants of some of the old attacks, and they're getting smarter and smarter using the botnets to, and of course, if it's a much more sophisticated player and they're really targeting you, then you're going to need to be on your toes. So we also talk about then as we head into our last couple of chapters, we talk a little bit more about information security. We define that in the first lesson. It's that whole idea of protecting all the assets. And so we then talk a little bit more about this conceptually in lesson 4. I won't spend a whole lot of time on this one, but we talk about, and one of those keywords, one of those terms you're going to see again and again, so you better get it down now, is the word controls, like CONTROLS, controls. When we attempt to do things that is taking action toward the goal of protecting information security, protecting our assets and protecting our networks, then we are implementing a control. And we talk about controls so that you understand them and you think about them. And once again, that word is going to show up. You'll read an article about cybersecurity and they'll recommend you implement these controls. Well, that's what they're talking about. Well, controls are all these things. So you read one of those frameworks and they'll talk about suggested controls. So there are all different kinds of controls. Some really ones I like to start with to make it easy, and they're maybe not any different than in the book, but there's only so many in a sense, is physical controls. And one that I kind of harp on in my private work as well as my educational work is lock the door. It amazes me that sometimes people will build amazing firewalls and defenses and then leave the server room unlocked. And you may think, well, who cares, right? It's actually really easy to get into server rooms. And I say that from experience, not as a hacker, but even in the last 10 years, I was working for a corporation about 10 years ago, and we were in an office building, and we were having some IT problems. And theoretically, we knew that it was, we were pretty sure it was not in our server room. We were in our server room, and we were pretty sure it was a hop over. So I wanted to be able to get in there and kind of confirm. And so it was actually very easy for me to talk the building management into letting me into the communication closet. Now, I'm a good guy. All I did was go in there and check, was I correct in my assumption that we had lost the link from here, and thus I could get AT&T out to fix our frame relay lease line. It wasn't just an IP problem on our end. They could claim I could prove where the signal was dropping and where the ping was dropping, and they needed to come out and fix this. But I was in the server closet for this whole building, and there's a bank on the first floor. There's another big nonprofit that dealt with nursing on the second floor. I mean, honestly, I could have tapped into all kinds of things, put in a tap point to be able to monitor all the traffic. And so, even that was one of the things that I made note of ourselves. I'm like, we need to pay attention. I actually made a note to the folks that ran our reception because they could see if anybody went around that corner. There's no reason for anybody to go down that because we had the whole part of the floor and no entrances there. And it was only the server closet kind of back behind, tucked in behind the elevator well back there. If you went that way, there are bathrooms. That way was the server closet. So there shouldn't be anybody going back there. And we literally taught our staff, if anybody went back there, to come tell IT, because we wanted to know that if anybody was going back there, and we would walk over and we would see, oh, so you're with Charter Communications. Oh, you're with so-and-so. Okay, just want to make sure you have right to be in here, because if you're in here, you can get to our stuff. And so that's the building. But of course, you own the building, a bigger organization, then, it blows my mind. People don't do things like that. The physical security. It's not too hard to get a job as a janitor if you're a hacker who wants in bad enough. And now you're in that building and you're in there vacuuming and cleaning, you turn the handle, oh, look, they didn't leave their server room, and you're in. So physical controls, putting control, sometimes even literally on computers themselves. There are the locks you can put on computers. I know in the earlier days, there's systems and security policies and things we can do now, but in some of the earliest days, I literally have watched people in a top security environment super glue USB sticks. Why? I mean, put super glue in the thing so that there was no way a USB stick could be inserted, because they didn't want that to be the vector that something came in a very top environment. Nothing should have come in or out. So they were in an isolated network, and that was how they chose to solve that problem in the early days. You could obviously remove those plugs physically from the box, and of course you can set up security rules, just like disabling auto run on a CD and things like that. But these are things we have to be aware of. So physical controls. We put in technical controls. You've already, probably run into it yourself. I mentioned it a minute ago in that brute force. Most systems will lock out a user after 3 or 5 or whatever it's set up, failed login attempts. That's a technical control. And any type of thing like that, just logins are technical controls. We obviously don't just have our networks wide open to the world. You have to log in. You have to have an email, username and password to get your email and things like that. That's a technical control. And then we also have things we call procedural controls. So if you work for a company, and the odds are many of you have already seen this, something like this, you may have had to sign an acceptable use document. In other words, the acceptable use of the IT service, technology that you have there as an employee. So companies will decide whether you can or cannot use your personal email while at work. You can or cannot go to Facebook or Amazon. And of course, they can put that in policy, and they can also block those sites, if they go that far. Different companies will make different things. Some companies will make it policy, don't do this, but they won't necessarily block it. But they may be monitoring it in case somebody does it, so an alert goes off and then they can warn. It all depends on the level of security that organization needs and that role needs. If that's just a salesperson with limited access, then what they do and the risk that their machine gets compromised and how it's impacted. But you have to look at that. If somebody gets that machine, they're now inside your network, so could they use that? And then we also have sometimes some controls that are put in place that are kind of borderline procedural, but they're also referred to as regulatory, or because you are required to put them in place. You have to do certain things. So we want to understand those controls, and we talk about examples of those. We also talk about a concept called product people, and I can't read my last note. Protections. And so what we're trying to do is we're using like a firewall as a product, and then we're training our people, and all of these things come together to provide the protection for the network. So it's not just one thing. It's not just saying you can't do X or putting a policy in place that says you can't surf to bad sites. You put in filters and proxies that stop that, because you're from getting there. You put in rules that say you must have a good password, but then the system validates so that it's checking against the database or making sure you're not using the name of your cat, or something simple that's a dictionary word, and your system can then enforce. So you many times, and it's very, very common that you have procedural rules, technical rules, all of them that these controls all work together to reinforce and to make sure that your network is protected and the information on it is protected. It even includes things like the information classification. If there's a need for that, you might follow the DoD standards of having like top secret and things like that, or you might just have confidentiality, public and top, whatever your classifications are. But these things are all part of how we set the framework of how we're going to control data. We're going to have different rules, stricter rules and controls on top secret data versus public data, and all these things help illustrate and lead us to a full featured security program. Now, the last thing that I do want to spend a little time on in lesson 4 before I wrap, I'm doing on time, and before I wrap up lesson 5, which is pretty straightforward. And we've covered a little bit of just a couple key topics there, but that's something called the 7 domains of the typical IT infrastructure. This is another one of these models you're going to see again and again, be referenced to online. We're going to teach you a lot of concepts and models in these first few classes. You'll learn about the OSI model later as well in the next few classes. But the 7 domains, it's the idea that in any organization, if you just say, how do I protect this? It's like everything else. Let's divide and conquer. Let's break things up. And so it's a logical breaking things up into different domains or areas. So we have the user domain or the user area that refers to the users themselves. And so you have to think about, what do they need? What are we going to need? So that's where acceptable use policies and password policies and certain things need to be applied. We have the workstation domain. That's, in today's market, is a broader than just PCs. It's laptops, PCs, tablets, smart devices, all kinds of things that are the workstations that our users use. And so what do we need to do there? Well, we need to have antivirus. We need to set up various policies. We need to limit what they can access. We need to set up rights and access control for those machines. We need to make sure they're patched and maintained. And so we then have our server domain. We have our infrastructure domain. We have our LAN, the network. We have our WAN, the wide area network. We have our remote access domain, which is very important these days. Lots of companies and organizations support remote workers, group collaboration. And so the whole IT infrastructure is in a sense broken into different chunks so that we can look at one at a time and kind of go, okay, if we're making sure we've covered everything, what do they need and what are the risks here and what are the threats here and vulnerabilities, and then what things should we take, steps should we take, controls should be put in place to protect those different areas. So we will see that more, and you'll see it on test, you'll see it in future. And so I wanted to make sure we point out 7 domains. If you have any questions, let me know. As I wrap up 5, because I'm running out of time, lesson 5 is after we've set some of these basics of information security, security roles, threats and attack, and a little bit more on information security, we start with defense basics. And we talk a little bit more about the challenges. I'll let you read that. It's some additional information. But then a couple of the main concepts that come out of there is like, why do we do this? Well, the biggest reason is money, funny enough, the same reason that the hackers do it. They're trying to make money. We're trying to not spend money. We're trying to save money. There's an article linked to in the materials about the Sony hack that most of our students can probably relate to and lived through, probably got a free game out of it if they had a PlayStation at that time. Huge cost to Sony in both embarrassment and lost customers. I'm sure there were a number of people that Christmas, their parents bought them an Xbox or a Wii because that PlayStation hack had just happened and it scared users. And some people, might have left. Most people, I had a PlayStation. I got the free game when mine was hacked, but we changed our passwords and we moved on. But, that kind of stuff, there are rules in place in the EU and the United States, particularly in certain states like California, that if a breach happens, you must disclose it. So you can't just say, oh, didn't happen. You've got to tell the world now. And if not, there could be huge fines. And then the bad press, the lost sales. If your organization, forget breaches, let's say somebody takes you down. If you are a company that makes all your money on the web and your website's offline for days on end, that could be the end of your business. So we do this to protect the company and to protect and to minimize costs and to make sure we're not violating any laws or any regulations. And of course, ultimately to enable our business to do its goals. So if our business is to help sell a product, or our business is a nonprofit organization, is a nonprofit to provide some service. That's what we're trying to enable. And so obviously, if we let ourselves be breached or taken down, a denial of service happens, then we're not able to carry out that mission. And so our main goal is usually financial, the avoidance of cost and liabilities related to these breaches. But also we want to maintain the business. As I've told plenty of IT and security people I've taught over the years, without the business or the organization, there is no IT. If there's not a company selling products, there's no need for a network and a database and all that. If there's not an organization taking funding, raising money as a nonprofit, trying to provide some service, literacy, or whatever, if that doesn't exist, there's no reason for those computers. There's no reason for that call center. There's no reason for that technology. And so don't get stuck in the mindset of, I'm an IT guy. We do IT for right now. We do it to empower our companies. And that's a big reason. And so we don't want these breaches. They take us down. They cost us our jobs. They cost us our company. Maybe we're really costing some noble goal that a nonprofit we work for is doing. So then to just throw out a few concepts, we'll talk more about them next week. I'll pick a little bit up before I move on into 6. But some of the first concepts that are really, really important, but actually some of the easiest to begin to understand is the concept of what we call either layered defenses or defense in depth. This is a concept that is key to success as best as possible within cybersecurity, and for that matter, in defending anything. Think about a castle. Whether you're a fantasy buff or not, you've probably seen a castle or seen one in a movie. Castles are a beautiful example of layered defenses. There might be a moat first. Well, actually, you could argue there's some clearing. They've cleared a good way around the castle so that they can see, or it's up on a hill so they can see down. So tactically, we already have an advantage. We can see a ways away, and there's a sort of a dead zone. If you're coming to attack, we're going to be able to come behind our walls to attack you. And so we have that. Then there's the moat and the drawbridge. Then there's the walls themselves with all these little arrow slits, and we can throw oil and stuff on you. And then even if you break into one layer, there's usually another layer. Maybe it's a double portcullis, so there's a kill area there if you come break your way in. If you breach one wall, there's usually an inner citadel with an additional wall. And this is exactly what we have to do in the digital world to protect our networks. We cannot just say, hey, we're going to throw up a firewall, we're protected. Yeah, we got the best firewall in the world. And then that's it, because if somebody gets in some other way, then we're doomed. I'll tell you a really quick example. It's one of my favorite stories, but this was years ago. Fortune magazine had ran a little article. They tried to get a lot of companies to do it, but they only got one company, Fortune 500 company, willing to, years and years ago, like I said, but in the early days of computing, if you will. This is the 90s. Oh my God, so long ago. Anyway, earlier days of all this and the internet really taking off, they got one Fortune 500 company to anonymously agree to be vulnerability and pen tested by a company called out of San Antonio, White Hat Hackers. At the time, I believe the company was Root Squared. Anyway, they came down to San Antonio, these suits and these senior guys and IT people from this Fortune 500 company, and they start the test in the morning. And one of the reasons that they did disclose in the article, they didn't disclose who, but the company had agreed because they had just put in place the latest and greatest firewall, and they were feeling pretty good. And so sure enough, in the morning session of the attempted vulnerability and pen testing, one of the senior guys kind of turns and looks at the guys and says, hey, no, you set your firewall up pretty good. That's pretty, and they kind of, all the suits smile and they're like, we done? And they're like, oh no, we're just starting. But your firewall's set up pretty nice. Let's see if we can get past that. So a little bit later, one of the young Birkenstock wearing young men, that's because a bunch of little hackers over there, hackers, white hat hackers, he walks up to one of the suits and says, can I have your business card? And then he goes over to an old school machine that's kind of tore up, and he sets it up. And long story, because we're running out of time here, is he sets up a war dialer, which is a computer with modem that then dials. And so he, of course, knew from the business card that the area code to the city they were. He assumed, because they were a big company and they came from headquarters, that they probably had that whole prefix, that whole building, and all those numbers tied to there. And that was true, as it turned out. So he set it up to dial all of those numbers, and it comes back at the end with the report and it says, phone line, fax line, etc. But when it came back with it, made the kid very excited, and ultimately the owner, and who was also a young person as well, a young group, but the senior guy there turns and says, we got you. And they're like, what? How? Turned out a senior vice president at the headquarters had installed an old program called PC Anywhere, which is kind of like Go to My PC or any of these type of TeamViewer type of programs we use today. and he'd put it on his own machine so that he could dial in from home over the weekend and work, and he didn't have a password. So now, of course, they said all we have to do is go to another machine. It's an older program, but we can install it, and we'll dial in, and we'll be on that machine, and we'll have it. And now we'll be inside your network, and we'll be on a senior VP's machine, and he won't have all access. He's gonna make our job easier. He's not just some sales guy or custodian or something. This guy's got access. He can see a lot of stuff, and so we pretty much own you. We're already in. We're behind that wonderful new firewall, and so that's the point of layered defenses. You need to have other types of defenses, and you need to be doing other things. Like, they should have found that out themselves. They should have checked their own phone numbers to see, is there a fax or a dial-up? Is there any kind of remote? That's rare and rare, but it doesn't mean it's gone. As a matter of fact, I know as an example that there were many times when, like, some of the big communication companies go to install a T1. If it's semi-remote, they will insist on a modem going out with it so that they can dial in to that and manage it. And that's great. But then if it's not disabled, then that's another way back in for somebody else. So anyway, I'm running out of time here. It's a little after, but that is through lesson 5. We'll talk a little bit more about security in depth and layered defenses as we go on to other defense topics in the rest of the lesson next week. Have a good day. We'll see you next week. And if you have any questions, drop me a message, email, or reach me through Slack. And thanks a lot. Have a good day.